what I'd like to discuss with you is a different type of inactivity. So I will tell you how we used mass spectrometry-based proteomics to understand what happens to the skeletal muscle of astronauts during long space flights. Oh, sorry. Is it better? Okay, good. So astronauts in space flight. So you may be familiar with the images of astronauts landing after a long flight on the International Space Station. They're very weak. They're mostly carried. And this is due to a rather extreme form of muscle atrophy that occurs in the absence of gravity. Before I show you, okay, yeah. So before I show you our data set, let me just shortly remind you how we use we do mass spectrometry-based proteomics. So we start from muscle biopsies here, but it could be any sample really. And so we first solubilize the proteins and then perform a proteolytic digestion, mostly with trypsin. And then the peptides are purified and electrosprayed into a mass spectrometer. And from the spectra that we obtain, we gather essentially two pieces of information for each peptide, namely the identity or the sequence of the peptide and the amount. And then we use computational platforms to make sense of this large amount of information. We align the searches to species-specific protein databases until we are actually obtaining a whole picture again that consists of thousands of quantified proteins. So this is our experimental design here. We have two astronauts who spent 6 months on the International Space Station. And for each astronaut, we have 3 muscle biopsies. So one taken before the mission, one on the day of landing, 6 months of flight, and one 2 weeks after landing. And so we have analyzed these biopsies using our proteomic platform. And so from these biopsies, we have quantified over 7,000 proteins, which corresponds to more or less 4,000 per sample. An important information here, we have quintuplicates. So each biopsy has been analyzed 5 times, and this is where we gather our statistics from. Luckily for us, these astronauts had been characterized very well before by the group of Marco Nari, which is a very important paper from 2018. And as you can see here, so astronaut A, the green astronaut, that will be color-coded throughout the talk, right? The green astronaut lost around 50% of its fiber cross-sectional area over 6 months of spaceflight. The other astronaut is doing a bit better, still lost 20%. In terms of strength, it's more or less the same pattern, but this difference is logical, right? Because these two astronauts trained very differently. You can see that the green astronaut was comparably inactive with respect to the red astronaut, who was training more at a higher load. But I sympathize with the green one, but to be honest, on Earth, this amount of exercise here would be more than enough to cause muscle hypertrophy and definitely mitochondrial biogenesis with 1g gravity. But sadly, this is absolutely not what happens in space, and I will show you. So to assess the effects of space flights on the muscle proteome, we took a longitudinal approach because we only have 2 subjects, basically. So for each subject, we compared the biopsy taken pre-mission to the biopsy taken on the day of landing. And I don't know if you're familiar with this way of representing the data. This is a so-called volcano plot. So this is a large t-test across the whole quantified proteome, essentially. And so on the x-axis, what you can see is the difference in expression log2. So whatever is on the left side here has a higher expression in the biopsy pre-mission, and whatever is here on the right side has a higher expression on the day of landing. So you can see there are very many differences between the biopsies at 2 time points. And we were interested in the changes that were common. We were interested in the proteins that were higher before the mission. So hence they decrease, right, during the mission. And if we do this analysis, we come up with 100 proteins that are significantly decreasing in both astronauts. And if we look at the annotation enrichment that are in these 100 proteins, all of them, all the top annotation enrichment are all referring to mitochondria, ranging from the TCA cycle to the respiratory chain. So we focused on the changes in the mitochondria proteome, and we're not alone there. So it has emerged in recent years that mitochondria are really a biological hub for the impact of spaceflight on human and animal biology. So we focused on the mitochondria, and to do that, we essentially extracted from our list of 7,000 proteins, the mitochondria proteins. And for that, we used MitoCarta3, which is a database that has compiled proteins that are with high confidence mitochondria. And it's about 1,100 proteins. And of those, we have quantified around 800. So we are reasoning on 70% of the mitochondrial proteome quantified here. As you can see, we have a good coverage of different compartments here. So I will show you data on the inner mitochondrial membrane. So to see what happens to the inner mitochondrial membrane, so we derived the 300 more or less proteins that we quantified that are assigned to the inner mitochondrial membrane. And we did paired t-tests comparing the biopsy pre-mission to the biopsy on the day of landing. And we obtained over 100 significant proteins per astronaut. So there are over 100 proteins of the inner mitochondrial membrane that significantly change in expression during spaceflight. And if you put these proteins on a hierarchical clustering system, what you can see is that we basically get one big cluster of proteins that are definitely decreasing significantly during spaceflight. You can see the color scale here. This is Z-score, basically high-low. You can see that everything is low in both astronauts during spaceflight. So mitochondria are a disaster. And this is true in both astronauts, relatively independent of the amount of exercise and effort they put into rescuing their muscle mass. So this is puzzling. If you want to see a little bit more detail, so this is a schematic of the 5 complexes of the respiratory chain. This is the duration post versus pre of all the proteins that we have quantified in each complex. You can see that astronaut A may be a bit worse. Yeah, but both are a disaster. Both are losing 50% of protein intensity in the respiratory chain, which is a whole lot. So, so is unloading responsible for all these changes? Is the fact that there's no gravity the reason why they lose 50% of their muscle mass? So if these changes are due to unloading, then other models of unloading at 1G should show similar changes. And so to assess this, we compared our spaceflight sample muscle biopsies to bed rest samples that we had obtained in the 2019 bed rest. Hi, everybody. And so we had actually not measured whole biopsies, but single fiber. So we had analyzed single fiber. The only difference is that I can tell you what happens in slow versus fast fibers. It's not very important, but oops, sorry. But the point is, so 10 days of bed rest, we see that they cause atrophy. You've seen it. They cause loss of force. You've seen it. However, we see no significant changes in the expression of the respiratory chain complexes. And let me just flash them for you. So this is a schematic again. This is complex 1, 40 proteins quantified. You can see what happens slow, fast 2A, and fast 2X fibers. Nothing. If you look at the trajectory, there's no significant change here over 10 days of bed rest. And this is from complex 1, complex 2, 3, 4, and 5. I really wanted to find significant changes and found none. However, you might tell me, okay, but you are showing 10 days of bed rest versus 6 months of space flight. That's unfair, right? True. However, there are data from other groups that show that there's a large decrease in respiratory chain complex proteins, oxphos proteins, after 11 days of space flight. So there seems to be a clear difference at this point between 1G inactivity model and activity with no gravity. So we wanted to look into this a little bit more, and you see there is a super high decrease in the expression of mitochondrial proteins, right? So in order to see how the mitochondria are remodeled, we needed to normalize for this difference. So proteomics is easy. So we divided the expression of each protein by the summed intensity of all mitochondrial proteins. So we compensated for the difference in quantity. We look at difference in the mitochondrial proteome at a qualitative level. What you can see here on the left side, there's a group of protein which is higher on the day of landing. And if you look at what is specifically enriched here, these are many proteins that are involved in the detoxification of reactive oxygen species and aldehyde detoxification. Bottom line, we're not measuring reactive oxygen species here, but I think I can declare them guilty by association. I think there is in this muscle a higher production of reactive oxygen species. And so we looked at the antioxidant response. We compiled a list of over 100 proteins that are involved in the detoxification of reactive oxygen species. So these are not mitochondria and these are not normalized. This is normal proteomic data. What you can see is something really puzzling. So the two astronauts, this is higher pre and this is higher at landing. What you can see immediately is that the majority of these ROX detoxifiers have a higher expression before the mission than after the mission. And so what we think is that there is a potentially dangerous mismatch with the production of reactive oxygen species and the ability of muscle in space to detoxify them. This is one thing I'd like to show, to see. The second thing is the astronaut, the red astronaut that trained more has a difference with respect to the other astronaut. For instance, has a very high induction of catalase and peroxyredoxin too. These are not significant, non-induced in this astronaut who trained less. So this could be individual variability or this could be training. But if we look at the detail here, you can see that astronaut A did not induce catalase or peroxyredoxin, on the contrary, whereas the astronaut that trained more had a healthy induction of catalase, which may be protective under these conditions. So this leads me to this hypothesis, basically. Let's see if you're sort of, we agree with me. So we think that ionizing radiation probably, but not inactivity per se, is the primary cause of mitochondrial damage in space. So what happens is when we are on Earth, we have a healthy balance of reactive oxygen species, which are also needed, by the way, for exercise, and the detoxification that keeps them at bay. If we train, we have muscle hypertrophy and mitochondrial biogenesis. That works. If we are inactive on Earth, and we have seen it yesterday, and we have seen it today, we have partial mitochondrial dysfunction, we have more ROS production, but if we insert exercise into bouts of inactivity, we rescue mitochondria and muscle mass. What happens in space is completely different. There is extreme atrophy. There is mitochondrial damage, probably due to large amount of reactive oxygen species and insufficient response, antioxidant response. If we train, we have a very partial response. We suspect that this is due to the induction of an antioxidant response rather than on a direct effect. And so in conclusion, what I think is exercise is very effective in preserving muscle mass, but not mitochondria when we are on the International Space Station. And also a disclaimer, I'm very much aware that these are only two subjects and that is correlation and not causality. So, okay, we are, analyzing data. But I think it's fair to say that the basic cause-effect relationship, the paradigm between physical exercise, muscle growth, and mitochondrial biogenesis works differently in space. I think it's fair to say that. And we think it's ROS and not just unloading that is affecting the mitochondria during space flight. Physical exercise is still recommended, but it probably acts not directly, but through the upregulation of an antioxidant response. And with that, I'd like to thank very many people, including the wonderful Badress team of 2019, Matthias Mann and his group, where I carry out all the measurement and analysis, Jörn at the German Aerospace Center, and all my wonderful colleagues in Padua, the Italian Space Agency, and all of you for your attention.